this session, the first session of the afternoon, which is titled Projet, processus et chaînes migratoires, trajectoires yéménites et irakiens. And it includes three presentations in the following way, by Batzion Eraqi Klorman, Mark Wagner, and Sasha Goldstein-Sabbah. This is a session that's about two different experiences from two different countries, Yemen and Iraq. Before I give the floor to Dr. Eraqi Klorman, I would like to introduce all of the speakers at once. And then our second speaker, Dr. Mark Wagner, is not present here. We have a registered talk that he's going to give second, and then we're going to move to Dr. Goldstein-Sabbah. So Dr. Batzion Eraqi Klorman is Professor Emerita of History at the Open University of Israel, formerly Dean of Academic Studies, founder and first director of the Center of the Study of Relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. She's a co-editor of Hamizra Hehadash, Journal of the Middle East and Islamic Studies Association of Israel. Her main research interests include history and culture of the Jews in the Muslim world, especially in Yemen, Mizrahi Jews in Palestine and Israel, Jewish-Muslim relations, women and gender, and immigration. She's published numerous books and articles in major academic platforms. Among them, I cite here, Traditional Society in Transition, the Yemeni Jewish Experience. She's published by Leiden and Boston. She's published by Brill, in 2014. Our second speaker is Dr. Mark Wagner. He's an associate professor of Arabic at the Louisiana State University. He is a specialist in Arabic literature with a particular interest in literary and legal texts from Yemen and in the cultural interactions between Muslims and Jews. He has published books and articles on a wide range of topics, among them Muslim and Jewish poetic traditions in Yemen, blasphemy in Islamic law, and Quranic exegesis. Among his publications, I cite here Jews and Islamic Law in Early 20th Century Yemen, which was published by Indiana University Press in 2015. Last but not least, Dr. Sasha Goldstein-Sabbah is an assistant professor at the University of Groningen. In the Netherlands, her primary interest is the modern history of Jewish communities in the Islamic world and their response to modernity. The majority of her research is based on archival material and historical press in English, French, Arabic, and Hebrew, dating from the 19th century and the early half of the 20th century. Her current research rethinks the connection between transnational solidarity organizations and empire. The focus is on the centrality and agency of non-European elite, thereby challenging assumptions about the center and the periphery within colonial networks. She recently published a book titled Baghdadi Jewish Networks in the Age of Nationalism, which was also published by Brill in 2021. So with that, I will give the floor to Dr. Eraqi Klorman, who will be speaking about les Juifs du Yémen et leur processus migratoire, Nouvelles perspectives. You have 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Omar.
Thank you.
I first want to really thank the organizers for organizing this very unique conference that allow us to exchange ideas about the theme of migration, and very special thanks for Joseph and for Claire for the hard work that they invested in this conference. Thank you very much. Okay. Jews lived in Yemen continuously since pre-Islamic time. However, a migration trend which began in late 19th century, a few years following the Ottoman occupation of 1872, led to the gradual diminishing of this community. In explaining Jewish migration for Yemen, I use migration studies concepts according which migration movements are promoted by various direct or indirect social disruptions, such as political conflict, economic crisis, environmental disaster. This line of thought maintains that migration is also linked to the community's social and economic resilience or vulnerability to disruption, to various pull factors, and the availability of informal social networks that support immigrants and encourage the arrival of new ones. My analysis differs from the Zionist meta-narrative regarding Jewish immigrations to Palestine and later to Israel, which explains immigration from Muslim countries in almost unified matter as a result of 20th century political developments, rising frictions between Jews and Arabs, and as ensuing from Zionist ideology. I also want to emphasize that, as we have seen in this conference, each community has its own a unique story, and it has to be studied along its specific circumstances. And we've seen it yesterday, and also in the panels that we heard earlier. In this paper, I argue that social disruptions increased during the Ottoman era, notably when global factors became prominent players around the Red Sea basin, affected both Jewish migration trends and Muslim emigration from Yemen. The importance of the Red Sea as a strategic waterway has historically attracted involvement of world powers. By 1839, the British captured the port town of Aden, and since the early 1860s, the French controlled Djibouti. The Ottoman Empire conquered Yemen in 1872, and in the 1880s, Italian forces landed in Ethiopia, later establishing the colony of Eritrea. The world powers' intervention in the area brought about new activity. Foreign troops and administrators stationed in Aden, Yemen, and East Africa encouraged economic undertakings. Foreign merchants were joined by local merchants, Jews and non-Jews, and these were followed by labor migrants. With the Ottoman conquest of Yemen, this country became an Ottoman province and part of a large empire in which travelers, traders, products, and informations all moved freely. The Ottoman contributed to the appearance of certain modernization processes and brought new methods of governance. The new approaches of government affected the Jewish community in a number of areas. One important issue was the legal status of the Jews. The Ottoman made an effort to better the legal and actual status of the Jews in Yemen along the Tanzimat reforms in the mid-19th century, which granted equal rights to the dhimmis, the protected people. Accordingly, the first Ottoman governor of Yemen sought to match the legal position of the Yemeni Jews to that of the Jews in other parts of the empire. In other words, he wanted to annul their legal status as dhimmis. However, the Yemeni Muslims fiercely opposed this change, and the Ottomans were forced to abandon their attempt at reform. Additionally, following the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, the slogans of justice, equality, and freedom reached Yemen. Numerous Jews hoped that the new regime would apply this principle to them, In particular, they expected the annulment of the jizya tax, which was levied on non-Muslims only. And they hoped for the cancellation of the Sharia law that barred Jews from testifying against Gentiles, but they were once again disappointed. As Yemen became an Ottoman province, Yemeni Jews became better informed of developments in the Jewish diaspora. They created new intercommunal connections, even developed ties with Jewish organizations such as Alliance Israélite Universelle and the Anglo-Jewish Association in London. Moreover, the Ottomans changed the governance of the Jewish community by connecting it to Istanbul. In 1872, they established the position of Hacham Bashi, chief rabbi, subordinate to the Hacham Bashi of Istanbul. This innovation created a formal and continuous link with the Jewish center in Istanbul and helped to strengthen ties between Jews of Yemen and those of the rest of the Ottoman Empire. Traditionally, the majority of Jews made their living through handicrafts and small industries. During the period of the Ottoman rule, there was an increase in economic activity. A great many merchants, Jews among them, came to Yemen in the wake of the Ottoman army and developed trading ties between it and other countries. Some Yemeni Jews from the center of the country supplied services to the Ottoman administrative apparatus and to the military forces, and more Jews began to engage in trade. Despite this, under Ottoman rule, Yemen became increasingly linked to the global economy and experienced the opening of its markets to imported industrial products that competed with local goods in both quality and cost. This process undermined the traditional infrastructure of the Jewish economy, which was based on the crafts and on cottage industry. By the end of the 19th century, Jews were being pushed from the crafts into retail trade, especially peddling. The Jewish peddler wandering about for weeks in the rural tribal Yemeni space in search for livelihood became a familiar phenomenon. Following the Ottoman occupation, Yemen experienced internal disorder resulting from tribal revolts and insurrections against the foreign regime. In addition, natural disasters such as 1903 to 1905 drought caused starvation, epidemics, and great human suffering. Contemporary Jewish writers reveal the great rupture of social and communal cohesion. They describe many people wandering in the country in search for food. Many, I quote from Arusi, one of the writers, a Yemeni Jewish writer, many dying of hunger on the roads, in houses, streets, markets, and deserts. This environmental calamity coincided with the rebellious attacks against the Ottomans and the siege of Sana'a by Imam Yahya Hamid ad-Din in the late 1904. Food scarcity in the city brought terrible famine and death to thousands. Sana'a surrendered to the Imam's forces in April 1905, only to be recaptured by the Ottomans in September. This prolonged warfare ended only with the Da'an Agreement of 1911 between Imam Yahya and the Ottomans. All of the above tribulations encouraged inner migration. In addition to internal migration, the aforementioned social and economic disruptions led to widespread labor migration by Jews and Muslims who became aware of economic opportunities elsewhere. Aden, which was the main crossroads for the movement of commodities and to and from Yemen, and had many small factories based on more advanced technologies than in Yemen, attracted cheap Yemeni labor and became major destination for such migration. Across the Red Sea, there were other locations that attracted Jewish and Muslim migrant labor. Somalia, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Egypt, all ruled by Western colonialist powers. Some of the Jewish migrants joined Adani Jewish settlements which were created in East Africa. A number of Adani Jews entered the Indian-British commercial network and later expanded their commercial activities to the coast of East Africa. Being British subjects, these Jews developed commercial ventures with Aden and with other Red Sea centers in Yemen, Sudan, Egypt, and elsewhere. Adani Jews are recorded as having founded thriving trading communities in Eritrea in the 1890s, especially in Asmara. These Adani settlements attracted Jewish migrants from inland Yemen. Some of these Jews remained in Africa, others stayed for months or years, then returned home. The migration of Jewish workers, which were part of a familiar network of production, further hurt the family-run craft shops and fueled the search for solutions to economic hardships. This process was reinforced by the immigration of Yemeni Jews to Palestine. A large-scale immigration from Yemen to Palestine began in 1881, some years after the Ottoman conquest. The political change generated the new context of a large empire whose citizens could travel unhindered from one place to another within its borders. Awareness of the development of Jewish settlements in Palestine, and especially in Jerusalem, stirred great interest among Yemeni Jews and inspired immigration there. In contrast to Jewish immigration to Palestine from European countries, which was often hampered by the Ottomans, movement from one region to another within the empire were almost not disturbed. Thus, the factors of disruption that had encouraged Yemeni Jews to emigrate were combined with their traditional and religious attachment to the Holy Land and was partly flavored with messianic hopes. The first groups of Yemeni immigrants to Palestine came from Sana'a in central Yemen, which were mostly affected by the time's disruptions. Later on, Jews also began to emigrate from other regions of Yemen. The settling of these immigrants in Palestine demonstrated to the remaining Jews in Yemen that the possibility of living in the Holy Land was quite real and that more of them could arrive. Furthermore, for the first time, the immigrants enjoyed civil rights that they had never had in their homeland, and equality before the law. Similar to most migration movements, the letters the Jews of Yemen received from their relatives in Palestine encouraging them to come were an important factor in motivating them to immigrate. The Yemeni Jewish immigrants in Palestine cultivated interconnections across geographical boundaries and served as absorbing agents for newcomers. They created informal migrant networks based on family and communal acquaintances. Such links provided vital resources for the newcomers in social and economic matters. They helped provide shelter for the initial period, gave support in personal matters, and assisted in coping with the Yishuv, the Jewish institutions. My paper emphasizes that immigration from Yemen to Palestine was unrelated to the Zionist movement. Throughout the entire period of Jewish presence in Yemen, no local Zionist organizations were active within Yemen, and the Zionist movement never had permanent representations in that country. Furthermore, secular national ideas as expressed by the Zionist movement barely affected the Yemeni Jews at all. This doesn't mean that there were some some individuals were attracted to the Zionist ideas. This is possible, but it was not a mass phenomenon. But certainly because newspapers arrived and the connection with their relatives, they were aware of what's going on in Palestine, and some of them might have been attracted to the Zionist ideology, but this was not a very impressive trend, if at all. Jewish immigration to Palestine is explained in this paper as stemmed firstly from general migration trends initiated during the Ottoman era, which also affected the Yemeni Muslim population. I suggest that the accessibility of Palestine as an Ottoman province intensified Yemeni Jews' religious attraction to Palestine, and that this fascination was articulated as traditional nationalism. Social disruptions in Yemen, described above, and the availability of social capital created by Yemeni Jewish immigrants in Palestine, all of these ensued that by 1914, approximately 8% of the total number of Yemeni Jews, about 5,000 people, had made their way to Palestine. This is you cannot compare it to any community, any Jewish community. 8% of its population immigrated to Palestine at this period of time. Yemeni Jews made up about 6% of the Jewish population of Palestine by at the beginning of World War I. Such large portion of the Yemeni Jewish community became an anchor that attracted other migrants during the British Mandate period. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and Imam Ahmad's permission for the Jews to live in May 1949 allowed the culmination of processes that have begun in the 19th century and led to the emigration of almost the entire Jewish community, about 50,000 souls from Yemen, and the process that led them to resettle as almost a whole community in the state of Israel. It was between 48, most so, and more so 49 and 1950, 51, almost the entire community have left willingly and settled in Israel at that time. Okay, thank you.
Wow. Wow, but you did we have a record time here, 15 minutes. I think people at UCLA trained you really well, not me. So our second speaker, who will be, we have a recorded talk here, is Dr. Mark Wagner. His presentation is titled Le poids des tensions économiques et sociales dans le départ des Juifs du Yémen. So we have another talk on Yemen.
Within the span of 16 months, in 1949 and 1950, almost all of the approximately 50,000 Jews in Yemen had made perilous journeys from remote mountain villages and towns to the British port city of Aden. From refugee camps in Aden, they were airlifted to Israel. The speed and comprehensiveness of the process, coupled with the dramatic story of the birth of the old new Jewish state on the heels of the Nazi campaign to exterminate the Jews of Europe, ensured that a large measure of myth-making would accompany the account of this mass migration. Batzion Eraqi Klorman deserves much of the credit for sorting myth from history. In her early work, she demonstrated that messianic movements arose with regularity among Jewish communities in Yemen, and that waves of immigration to Palestine ought to be placed in that context. In her magisterial Social History of the Jews of Yemen, she complicated a romanticized image of Yemen as a kind of time capsule by showing the profound effects that its forcible integration into the world economy while under Ottoman rule left on its Jewish communities. Zionist institutions played no small role in this mythologizing process. Among the diverse Jewish communities of the Arab Islamic world, the Jews of Yemen were arguably easiest to fit within a narrative of persecution followed by nationalist redemption. In the context of domestic Israeli politics, decoupling the historical experience of Yemenite Jews from Zionist meta-narrative might serve a more pragmatic purpose, prying a voting bloc that has reliably voted for the right for 2 generations and setting it in another direction. In the midst of the chaotic process in the early years of the State of Israel, euphemistically dubbed absorption, Yemenite Jews themselves learned quickly that advancing their own interests required casting arguments in terms of the Zionist meta-narrative. Specifically, they felt the need to prove that their suffering was commensurate with the suffering of European Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. In this presentation, one of my main sources is a corpus of mainly self-published memoirs by Yemenite Jews who emigrated to Israel. While immensely useful and interesting, Eraqi Klorman notes that the voluminous body of letters and memoirs by Jews from Yemen rarely mention the large financial losses that Jews, particularly urban merchants, suffered. Perhaps these writers saw a contradiction in demonstrating both their ideological and religious commitments to Zionism and their status as economic refugees. Jews in Yemen often sold their property for a fraction of its market value, faced coercion to sell from neighbors, and converted assets into cash that they were unable to take out of the country. In 1932, Avraham Tabib, a leader of the Yemenite Jewish community in Palestine, contrasted European anti-Semitism with the oppression of Jews in Yemen. In Europe, Tabib wrote, Jew haters occasionally organized pogroms, quote, and afterwards their anger abated for decades, end quote. In Yemen, mass violence against Jews was very rare, but daily harassment was worse. The European anti-Semite, argues Tabib, was like a fox in a henhouse, content to kill a hen now and then, while the other hens went about their business. In Yemen, quote, the whip was always stretched over their backs and they had no rest. Without a doubt, Muslims persecuted Jews in highland Yemen under the theocratic rule of the Zaydi Shiite imamate. Within Yemen's caste-like social system, Jews occupied one of the lowest ranks. Sumptuary laws, or quasi-arbitrary rules aiming to demonstrate the superiority of Muslims over non-Muslims, were enforced by Muslim rulers with varying degrees of zeal. As with rules concerning the mixing of the sexes, such rules were often much more strictly enforced in densely populated urban areas than in rural areas. While the sumptuary laws could be found throughout the pre-modern Arab Islamic world, individual Muslim scholars in Yemen innovated in several fields of cruelty. 2 18th century scholars decided that the job of collecting human excrement belonged to Jews. Another argued successfully that fatherless Jewish children ought to be seized by the state and raised by Muslim families as Muslims. Naturally, the extent to which the conflict between Zionist settlers and Palestinians became increasingly a pan-Islamic issue in the 1930s exacerbated the pre-existing situation. Despite the reality of Muslim persecution of Jews in Yemen and the role Jewish persecution played in the Zionist narrative, I would like to suggest that the most important stage on which persecution needed to be proven consisted of a much larger international legal regime regarding refugees that was in a state of flux, a regime whose contours the great powers largely shaped according to their own interests. Moreover, the persecution of the Jews of Europe played a role both in the Zionist narrative and in the development of international refugee law. I do not intend either to minimize the social strictures under which Jews in Yemen lived or to suggest that individual Jews' espousal of political Zionism was insincere. However, the bounds of post-World War I international refugee law offered Yemenite Jews an overwhelmingly strong incentive to present the political case for their migration in terms of persecution. Moreover, the crisis of Yemen's Jewish refugees peaked at the same time the political organs of the Zionist movement were focused on the plight of Jewish survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. This provided an additional incentive for Yemenite Jews to present themselves as equally needy victims of anti-Jewish persecution. The reality and narrative of persecution aside, Jews in Yemen faced a very real economic crisis brought about by Yemen's incorporation into the global industrialized economy. In highland Yemen, where agriculture was dominated by Muslims, Jews worked mainly as artisans and peddlers. The increasing predominance of inexpensive manufactured goods in the 20th century, as well as an expanding infrastructure for goods and services, pushed many Jews out of these professions. While many Jews lost their livelihoods, a very small number of Jewish importer-exporters became both wealthy and visible for their ties to the ruling Muslim elite. Ironically, Yemeni nationalists found a new target for resentment, Jewish wealth, at the same time that the economic status of Yemen's Jews in general declined rapidly. Ottoman rule over Yemen brought economic opportunity along with hardships. A new mercantile elite who supplied the military arose in this period, many of whom came from the lower ranks of the traditional social order. Some Jews were able to join this elite as well. Yemenis enjoyed greater freedom of movement, and long-distance transportation became less perilous. Most importantly, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who reigned from 1876 to 1909, opened Yemen to foreign trade. The new economic environment led to the slow demise of professions long identified with Jews. While some Jews became wealthy through imports and exports, the availability of manufactured goods harmed Jewish artisans. Around the turn of the century, a Jewish blacksmith who specialized in making scales to be used in the market struggled to contend with this change by teaching himself how to make facsimiles of the large scales that were beginning to be imported from Europe. A silversmith in a small town, whose business consisted mainly in decorating Muslims' weapons, remarked that the new European rifles left no room for ornamentation. Jews were cognizant of both this changed environment and the new skills that might enable them to weather it. In 1903, rabbis wrote to the Alliance Israélite Universelle in Paris asking that they build, quote, a new school for languages and trade because, quote, most of the people of our community roam around searching for food for themselves and their babies by employing the trades they used to employ, but they cannot find it, for the spirit of the age will not give them a path to tread any longer. In 1913, a sizable roster of Yemenite rabbis wrote to the Ottoman government in Istanbul asking for the establishment of a, quote, preparatory and professional school for Jews in Sana'a. A modern school was established but existed for only 2 years. At least one imam felt that he paid lower prices to Jewish merchants than to Muslims. The primary tax that Jews paid went directly to the imams in the form of the poll tax, the jizya. This would have given the rulers additional incentive to patronize Jewish businesses. Yosef Tobi argues that in the 1920s and 1930s, the regime pursued a policy of nationalizing commerce that harmed the economic status of the Jews. While some Jewish merchants who enjoyed special ties with the aristocracy or who were able to import machinery from Europe to mechanize their crafts benefited from this policy, the majority, particularly small-scale craftsmen, faced new competition with Muslims that had not previously existed. This conclusion requires further research, especially in light of the common assertion among Muslim writers that the Imam relied heavily upon Jews in implementing his economic policies. The Imam's sons and ministers controlled numerous quasi-monopolies, which earned them the enmity of small traders in large cities who were unable to compete with them. A Yemeni historian argues that Imam Yahya used taxes and customs fees to punish Muslim merchants who had backed the losing side during his bid for power. A council of learned Muslim men cautioned government officials against meddling in trade. Muslim merchants perceived a special relationship between Jewish merchants and the Imam. Indeed, it is not surprising that members of the administration would rely upon Jewish merchants who were loyal and small-scale, and thus non-threatening, in pursuing their business interests. One Yemeni historian writes that the monopolistic trade that developed between the Imam and Jewish merchants exacerbated the already widespread hatred for Jews among Muslims. Quote, Imam Yahya put no restrictions upon Jewish mercantile activity, writes another Yemeni historian. Quote, indeed, we find a monopolistic trinity between them, the most powerful administrators and him. In the early 1940s, a visitor from Iraq noted that a handful of Jews acting in tandem with other Jews in Aden, quote, controlled the rudder of trade. The Sunaydar family, one of Sanaa's most prominent merchant families, produced a number of opponents to Imam Yahya. The most famous member of the family, Al-Izzi Saleh Sunaydar, lists among the evils of imamic rule their, quote, granting the Jews free rein in trade, end quote, making them compete with Muslim merchants, and is allowing them to use their homes to store goods, whereas Muslim merchants had to pay for storehouses and the various attendant costs. Muslim merchants were selectively taxed. All of these factors led Muslim merchants of Sana'a to support the opposition, he argues. During Ramadan in the summer of 1920, this chief broker of Sana'a's market attempted an end run around a Jewish merchant with good ties to Imam Yahya. He brought a complaint to the governor of the city against a prominent Jew, Suleiman Hibshush, and his sons. The complaint, which one Jewish writer says was, quote, signed by hundreds of merchants, alleged that the Jewish brokers sold Muslim merchants ordinary goods while hiding sought-after goods in storehouses in the Jewish quarter, in defiance of the established practice of storing goods in two large storehouses in the central, exclusively Muslim part of Sana'a, that they extended credit to Muslims capriciously but to Jews reliably, and that they sold goods to the Muslim merchants at retail prices rather than at wholesale prices. The same Jewish memoirist who details this episode claims that the Jew in question turned to Imam Yahya, and the very next day the Imam had a long legal opinion drawn up which protected the Jew. He describes the initial complaint as an anti-Jewish conspiracy by a Jew-hater aimed at agitating Muslims against ordinary Jews. While this sounds like an exaggeration, his claim that the Imam saw the complaint of the Muslim merchants as an unacceptable challenge to his authority, and the claim that the defeated merchants spoke bitterly of, quote, the Imam of the Jews rather than the Imam of the Muslims, as he ought to be, sounds plausible, however. Another instructive example of the putative imamic Jewish mercantile alliance revolves around the same Jewish family. Imam Yahya took a tithe from each coffee harvest, and it was sold at auction. One year the crop was of a particularly good quality, and the Imam's agent invited 3 prosperous Muslim coffee merchants to bid on it. The men engaged in insider trading, agreeing before the auction that each would suggest a different price, and also agreeing that the one who succeeded would divide the trade with the other 2. The Imam wanted a Hibshush representative at the auction. Lest he be seen as confronting the Muslim merchants, Harun Hibshush sent his young son Yechiel to the auction. His bid, which was a little higher than the prices offered by the other merchants, was accepted. The Muslim merchants demanded and received financial compensation from Harun Hibshush, who became the sole seller of the coffee tithe. Quote, the Imam was satisfied by the higher price, which was just. My father was satisfied with the stand that he had taken and the compromise that had been reached, writes Yechiel Hibshush. Resentment against the new Jewish mercantile class was not limited to Muslim competitors or Muslim religious conservatives. Chaim Tzadok, a Jew from Sana'a who emigrated to Palestine and then returned to Yemen as a representative of the Jewish Agency, writes about their status during the lean years of World War II. Quote, these important Jews never worked, yet had their bread, and sometimes a lot of it. With their work, they mainly supported those who worked for the government, but what was left over sustained and supported their families. Quote, their hands were in everything, and everybody's hands were in them, as the biblical verse Genesis 16:12 says. Their morality was dubious, and usually most were counted among those whose fear of God was lacking. So much so that if a Jew was jailed, it did not disturb their repose. Indeed, this happened. As for this class of people who were close to the government, a saying circulated widely among the Jews, quote, he who values his own life should steer clear of them, which is a quotation from Proverbs 22:5. According to him, their closeness to government ministers did not merely obligate them to fill the ministers' pockets, but also to take care of several more matters, chief among them supplying brandy, which Muslims were prohibited in the strictest terms from drinking and enjoying. This duty forced the Jews to arrange the production of, quote, private liquor in their own houses, making the forbidden drink there. Their recompense was exponential, and this source of income was used to grease the wheels of their business. Chaim Sadok's resentful tirade suggests that the wealthy Jewish intermediaries were primarily enriching the Muslim elite, and also that alcohol didn't represent just one among many luxury goods that they supplied, but was central to this relationship. In conclusion, while the international legal framework for refugees ensured that Jews from Yemen would present their reasoning for emigrating primarily in terms of fleeing persecution, the historical record shows that economic factors were at least, if not more important, to the need they felt to migrate. Yemen's abrupt incorporation into the world economy threw traditional artisanship into crisis and created economic competition between Jews and Muslims that had not existed previously. Moreover, in light of the Imamic government's various attempts to command the economy and create quasi-monopolies for individual members of the royal family, political and economic instability were deeply intertwined. In a particularly ironic twist of fate, the wealth of a handful of prominent Jews close to the Imams helped create a widespread perception among Muslims that Jews in Yemen were getting wealthy at Muslims' expense. In reality, very few Jews benefited from the situation, and the financial status of the majority worsened. Once it became clear that the Jews would leave Yemen en masse, their property became virtually worthless. Thank you.
So now I'm going to give the floor to my colleague, Sasha, who will be talking about, who given the last talk for this panel on the Jews of Iraq and the experience in Iraq. And the title of the presentation is Retour à Bagdad, Élargir le cadre de la migration des Juifs irakiens. Sacha, the floor is yours.
Merci. Je voudrais très rapidement remercier les organisateurs de cette magnifique conférence. Je vais faire mon intervention en anglais, je suis désolée, mais je serai très heureuse de répondre à toutes vos questions en français après. Voilà. So I can read. Can you, everything okay? Oh, I'm going to be speaking in English. Yeah, so that's what I just said. In French, I said I'm just going to speak in English. Yeah, that's fine. It's been a long day. Not going to speak for too long. I really want to focus on one idea, which has been spoken about a bit already, and I think it's an important thing as we get to a next level in understanding why Jews left the Arab world and also why some Jews stayed in the Arab world. And that's really the question of global diasporas and transnational Jewish networks. So, and then I should probably, well, I'll go to there already. On the eve of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, you have about 135,000 Jews living in Iraq. However, what people sometimes forget is that we have at least about 15,000 self-identified Baghdadis living beyond the borders of Iraq already, in places such as East Asia, Cairo, Mandate Palestine, and Europe. And in this case, a Baghdadi is somebody who has a strong connection to Iraq. They're of Iraqi heritage. Perhaps they're a citizen, perhaps they've become a British subject, but they have that connection there. And so my paper is really about how, by understanding these networks and connections, we can understand the downfall of the Iraqi Jewish community in a different way by seeing them as inherently global with economic, social, and political connections around the world. So I'm going to try to look at this factor going beyond kind of the historic Zionist and anti-Zionist narratives, and that's why I put the term longue durée, and really placing the end of this community in situ within Iraq, within a larger framework of Iraqi Jewish history, by looking at the satellite communities in East Asia in particular. And I'm going to talk about one man named Ibrahim Nahum, particularly because a lot of the research and the way I reconstructed these networks was based on the Kadoorie family archives in Hong Kong, and Ibrahim Nahum is their cousin in Baghdad, who's their agent. And so we have several decades of correspondence between them, and we get to understand how these networks worked. So, the first wave of Baghdadi emigration occurred between around 1818 and 1830, when a select group of intrepid Jewish merchants, primarily from Baghdad and Basra, but also from Syria and Persia, who outside of the Middle East will identify with Baghdadi communities, actually, sometimes referred to as the Baghdadi trade diaspora, began to leave the Middle East for the Indian subcontinent. In the 19th century, the Baghdadi Jews settled in Bombay, then Calcutta, later expanding their networks to Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Rangoon, with smaller, we'll call them micro-communities, existing in Karachi, Dhaka, Penang, Yokohama, and Surabaya. And I think after Eric's presentation, we should really add Bahrain to this list. The motivations behind this first wave of departure from Baghdad was a mixture of political instability and economic opportunity brought on by the expansion of the British East India Company. After the initial group of Baghdadis, the main motivation for the migration was actually economic opportunity. In fact, one issue that plagued the community in the late 19th century was the preference for educated young men of the Jewish community in Baghdad to leave for these satellite communities because the jobs were better, right? So this is the 19th century brain drain, shall we say. And this eastward migration continued in the 20th century as each of these trading centers developed small Baghdadi satellite communities that remained tightly linked to each other and to Baghdad. Once these merchants had established profitable firms, they attracted less wealthy, less politically connected, and less educated Baghdadi Jews, lured by the employment offers from these large Baghdadi firms and the general business opportunities that the East was believed to offer. So whereas perhaps for Eastern European Jews, America was the golden state, certainly for the Baghdadis, they looked towards East Asia. This migration trend would last until the dissolution of the community. For Baghdadis, the East came to represent the land of opportunity for those who did not see their future confined to the borders of Iraq. So in terms of numbers, very difficult and often fluctuating. And in my book, I have a much more extensive listing of these numbers. And as you can see, I haven't included all of the communities because we really don't know, and it changes all the time, and it goes up and down based on a myriad of factors. But usually, for the first half of the 20th century, somewhere between 10 and 15% of those who were part of this global Baghdadi community lived somewhere in East Asia. And this rise in population is a testament to the continuous trickle of individuals to the satellite communities. Given the importance of family networks, these numbers suggest that it would have been difficult to find Baghdadis abroad who did not have direct familial connections to Baghdad well into the 20th century, and vice versa. As Baghdadi satellite communities grew and built their communal edifices, it's important to note that they did not distance themselves from the Jewish community of Baghdad, nor was migration seen as unidirectional. It was not unheard of for families to move to India or the Far East for a few years and then return to Baghdad once sufficient money and trade contacts had been made. Others would return to Baghdad out of homesickness or the inability to learn the local languages or sufficiently integrate into life abroad. Overall, up until the dissolution of the community, in Baghdad, the Eastern Baghdadis continued to support the communal institutions of the Jewish community in Baghdad and to defer to Baghdad for spiritual guidance. So they would still defer to the chief rabbi in Baghdad. Beyond the organic back and forth of Baghdadis between Iraq and the satellite communities, the reasons for this continued attachment to Baghdad are numerous. The essential point, however, is that wherever in the world the Baghdadis settled, they saw themselves as a single community that transcended location and sometimes language, right? Because in Iraq, they spoke primarily Arabic, but over time, with more generations, you had Baghdadis in East Asia and in Europe who, at home, transferred slowly to English, although certainly Arabic remained central to the communal identity. But central to this idea was also that Baghdad represented the historic center of Jewish life for their community, and it was the responsibility of those in the satellite communities to help maintain its vitality and ensure its future. And right, so Baghdad is sometimes referred to as a little Jerusalem, like we see with some Jewish communities in Morocco as well, who they refer to their cities in that way. But if we look at it from the perspective of philanthropy, for example, appeals for a 1925 fundraising campaign for Jewish schools by the Lay Council in Iraq were sent to Baghdadis residing in Calcutta, Shanghai, Bombay, but also people residing in London, Manchester, Cairo, Alexandria, Paris, and Marseille. These requests were modest, and a few pounds or rupees a year per family were given. Although even those who were not wealthy, this shows kind of that even those who weren't wealthy still supported Jewish life in Baghdad. And this means that the communal budgets also depended on this charitable giving. So in conclusion, I think when we talk about the period up until 1948, there's a constant back and forth of people, of movement, and there is a tremendous amount of remittances going back to Baghdad as well. And so the communities are mutually dependent on each other for different reasons. So, I'm not done. You still have time, right? Yeah. So I want to highlight one person, and that's Ibrahim Nahum. And Ibrahim Nahum is a super interesting guy because he is the agent of his Kadoorie cousins, who in today's money would be billionaires in the modern money. And Nahum is their agent in Baghdad, and he is responsible for managing the schools of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, but actually for the whole region. And in that capacity, he is very much this, in some ways, cosmopolitan Jew, but who never lives anywhere else besides Baghdad. He's well-traveled. He goes to Lebanon on vacation. He goes to Jerusalem for conferences, but also to take his wife to the hospital there. And he is then dependent on these connections with East Asia, but he's also very much representative of the networks between Jews within the Levant in this period, right? This is him in Damascus at a school opening. He goes to school openings in Lebanon as well. And he's also a member of the Iraqi parliament, so he can be part of politics. He's not a fervent Iraqi nationalist. He doesn't identify with Zionism, at least anywhere in his writings. But for him, this idea of a Baghdadi diaspora and this symbiosis between Jews in Baghdad and those who identify with Baghdad, who live outside of Iraq, is central to his life, as is it being a Jewish Iraqi citizen. So the question then becomes, what happens in 1948, right? And for those of you who know the work of Orit Bashkin, that's how she starts the final chapter of her book. She says, we don't really understand why the community dissolves so quickly. And this is something I've also pondered. And I think one of the reasons is the changing geopolitical landscape. And obviously, the creation of the State of Israel is a catalyst for this, but it's more complicated than that. And one of the major issues is that the borders begin to close. And the borders begin to close because of martial law being installed in Iraq, because Jews can no longer travel freely, but also because all of these Baghdadis who live abroad can't remit funds anymore. And their commercial networks are also challenged as well. So the communal budgets suffer in this case. In addition to this, after World War II, the Baghdadi satellite communities experience extreme precarity. In India, the Baghdadis are concerned about partition, and they need to figure out what they're going to do after the partition. And I'm not talking about Israel-Palestine right now. I'm talking about India and Pakistan. The Baghdadi community in Singapore is interned during World War II, and they're trying to figure out where to go. And up until even 47, a lot of the Singaporeans try to go back to Baghdad. But after 48, they're trying to go to Australia, and they're trying to go to England or to the US. Shanghai, with the rise of communism, and also World War II, which is devastating, is also an issue. So they're not getting the remittances, and this network, which actually had a symbiosis with the Iraqi state because it was seen as being financially advantageous, breaks down due to internal political instability within Iraq. And so what happens is that all of those who do have some economic or political agency look for ways to get out of Iraq. But on the second level of that, all those who are dependent on these communal networks, there's no state welfare system, so schools, hospitals, charities, they see this network dissolving. And we see in the correspondence with Nahum that he actually works from 48 to 51 to tie up the communal infrastructure, to get all of the Sefer Torahs out of Iraq, to see what important art can be taken out, how money can be reassigned to support people elsewhere. And so I think it's the unraveling of this community in part, which is one of the reasons why the Iraqi Jewish community overwhelmingly migrates to Israel between 1949 and 1951. There's certainly, it's not Zionist fervor, and it's never been in the Iraqi case. But it's this idea that the communal infrastructure is decimated due to what's happening to the satellite communities and then to internal Iraqi politics, which really limit the way the community has functioned, and they're just not able to adapt at that point. Thank you very much.
This is